Well, there's a widely accepted idea today. If you stay single for too long, something must be wrong. The questions come quickly. So does the advice, as if being alone were a problem to fix. Not a valid choice. But what almost no one says is that at many points in life, staying single isn't a sign of delay, it's a sign of clarity. Being single forces something that relationships often postpone, a direct encounter with who you are when you're not being chosen, validated, or mirrored by someone else. Without emotional distractions, certain questions surface. Without the constant presence of another person, certain patterns become visible, precisely because they're easier to ignore inside a relationship. That's why so many people rush into the next bond. Not out of love, but out of relief. Relief from having to face themselves alone. This video isn't about rejecting relationships, it's about understanding why, in certain phases, staying single can be the most strategic, honest, and transformative decision a person can make. If you've ever felt pressured to move on too quickly, this might offer a perspective that completely changes the game. There's a reason why being single feels so uncomfortable. And it's not loneliness. When you're single, there's no one to share decisions with, justify choices to, or cushion insecurities. Everything you feel comes straight back to you. No constant emotional distraction. Relationships, and even healthy ones, create a kind of psychological comfort zone. They offer validation, emotional routine, and a sense of belonging. There's nothing wrong with that. But it can be numbing. Many important questions get postponed simply because someone is there filling the space. Being single interrupts that postponement. Suddenly choices become clearer. There's no longer a we to hide behind the I. You start noticing patterns that were once attributed to the other person. Reactions that seem like responses to the relationship reveal themselves as personal traits. And that's not comfortable. That's why so many people associate being single with failure. Not because it's bad, but because it demands emotional responsibility. Without a relationship to blame or compensate, you're forced to deal with your own limits, desires, and contradictions. Another rarely discussed aspect is that being single dismantles ready-made narratives. The idea of linear progress, meet someone, date, move forward, loses its grip. You stop following an automatic social script and start living without guaranteed applause. That can bruise the ego. It also stirs up the fear of falling behind. In a world where everything seems to move fast, being single can feel like stagnation. But in practice, it's often the opposite. It's the only moment when decisions stop being driven by external pressure. That's when you start asking yourself whether you actually want someone, or just don't want to be alone, whether you're seeking connection or emotional distraction, whether you enter relationships by choice or by anxiety. These questions don't show up when life feels too comfortable. They emerge in silence, in the space left behind when there are no constant messages, shared plans, or outside expectations. Being single also redefines freedom. Not the idealized freedom of not answering to anyone, but the harder kind, choosing without an audience, deciding without immediate validation, failing without someone there to soften the fall. That's intimidating, because it requires maturity, and the ability to stand by unpopular choices. That's why so many people jump from one relationship to the next, not out of overwhelming passion, but out of intolerance for the space that singleness creates. In that sense, if being single feels unbearable, the problem may not be being alone, but everything that surfaces when you are. And that's exactly where being single stops being the absence of something and becomes fertile ground for much more important questions about yourself. At some point, being single stops being just a relationship status and becomes a mirror, one that reflects exactly what's there. Without a relationship filtering emotions, conflicts, and expectations, a person begins to notice something that once went unseen. Many choices made as a couple were, in fact, ways of avoiding individual choices. The we functioned as shelter, as justification, as emotional comfort. When that shelter disappears, an unavoidable question emerges. What do I do when no one is deciding with me? That question carries weight because it reveals subtle dependencies. Not only dependence on affection, but on structure, schedules, plans, reference points. A relationship organizes life in a quiet way. Being single dismantles that structure and forces you to build your own. That's where many people feel lost and confuse that discomfort with loneliness. But they're not the same thing. Loneliness is a lack of connection. What shows up here is a lack of practice being with yourself without distraction. Being single demands a kind of honesty that few relationships require. You start noticing repeated patterns, the types of people you're drawn to, the conflicts that always resurface, the moments when you minimize yourself to keep someone close. Without immediate emotional involvement, these repetitions become obvious. That can be uncomfortable because it dismantles convenient narratives. The idea that it just didn't work because it was the wrong person starts to lose strength. In its place comes a harder question to face. What do I consistently bring into my relationships? This is a crucial turning point. It's not pleasant, but it's powerful, because for the first time you have space to observe without having to act, without having to please, without having to adapt yourself to maintain a bond. Another rarely discussed effect is how being single reshapes neediness. The desire for connection doesn't disappear, but it becomes clearer. You begin to distinguish between wanting to share life with someone and fearing being alone. And that distinction changes everything. When that clarity emerges, choices begin to shift. Some relationships stop looking so appealing. Certain behaviors become intolerable. What once felt normal starts to feel exhausting, not out of arrogance, but awareness. Being single also changes your relationship with time. Without the pressure to make it work with someone, decisions lose their urgency. You begin to realize you don't have to resolve everything right now, that not every connection needs to turn into commitment that you can explore without attaching yourself. This unsettles those who were trained to measure value through relational stability, but at the same time it restores something essential: emotional autonomy. The ability to choose without panic, to step back without guilt, to move forward without anxiety. This stage isn't comfortable, but it's rare. Few people stay in it long enough to understand what's happening. Most rush into the next relationship before these questions grow too large. But those who stay begin to realize something important. Being single isn't standing still. It's stepping out of autopilot. And stepping out of autopilot completely changes the kind of relationship you're willing to accept afterward. When someone spends a long time moving in and out of relationships, they learn to negotiate too much. They adjust boundaries, expectations, and even desires to keep the bond functioning. This builds relational skill, but it also creates a habit of constant concession. Over time, it becomes hard to tell what is a genuine choice and what is automatic adaptation. Being single interrupts this cycle. Without the need to sustain an ongoing emotional agreement, the person begins to notice where they tend to give in too quickly, where they over-explain, where they accept less than they want just to avoid rupture. These insights don't usually appear in deep internal dialogues. They show up in everyday practical situations. For example, when someone shows interest and you realize you don't feel like responding right away. Or when a promising connection appears, but you notice something doesn't quite fit, and for the first time you don't feel an urgent need to ignore it. That kind of pause changes everything. Being single teaches something few relationships allow you to learn calmly: the difference between liking someone and choosing them. Liking is impulse. Choosing requires discernment, and discernment only forms when there's no pressure to decide quickly. Another important point is that extended time being single dismantles the fear of missing out. When you realize that life continues to function and even improves in some ways without being in a relationship, the anxiety about letting something slip away decreases. This directly affects the kind of connection you accept later on. Relationships stop being evaluated by their ability to fill a gap and start being evaluated by the quality of what they actually offer. Interest isn't enough. Attraction isn't enough. Short-term compatibility isn't enough. The question shifts to a deeper level. Does this support who I am now? That shift completely changes the dynamic. You no longer enter relationships trying to make them work at any cost. You enter observing, feeling, testing real compatibility, not just initial chemistry. There's also a direct impact on how conflict is experienced. People who have spent time single tend to tolerate the possibility that things may not work out. That doesn't create emotional coldness. It creates calm. The calm of knowing that your life doesn't depend on that specific bond. This reduces emotional games, reduces fear of abandonment, reduces the need to constantly prove your value. And ironically, it makes you more present when you do choose to stay, because staying stops being a necessity and becomes a choice. This is the point that completely changes the kind of relationship built afterward. Relationships chosen without urgency tend to be less dramatic, less unstable, and less based on unrealistic expectations. Not because they're perfect, but because they're not carrying the job of saving anyone. Being single also teaches how to end things better. When there's no panic about returning to solitude, a person can recognize incompatibilities earlier and leave with less emotional damage. This prevents long but empty relationships. It prevents insisting on situations that only prolong discomfort. None of this means that being single is comfortable all the time. It isn't. But it's precisely in this specific discomfort that something rare is formed: the ability to choose without fear. And when someone enters a relationship from that place, the dynamic changes completely. There's no rush, no urgency, no early negotiation of fundamental boundaries. There is presence. And that's something you don't learn by jumping quickly into the next relationship. That's exactly why staying single at certain moments isn't a waste of time. It's quiet preparation for relationships far better than the ones that came before. If you've made it this far, subscribe to the channel and leave a like on the video. That helps this kind of content reach more people who may be living through this exact moment. Now let's close this conversation. Being single stops being the best thing you can do when it turns into avoidance, but it becomes one of the smartest decisions when it's a conscious choice. The difference between the two is subtle and decisive. When someone stays single out of clarity, not fear, something shifts deeply in how they relate to the world. There's no rush, no neediness disguised as intensity, no urge to prove worth through another person. Life starts to organize itself around a more stable center. This doesn't mean rejecting relationships, it means stopping using them as emotional solutions. Relationships stop being a crutch and start being expansion. And that change affects everything: the kind of people you attract, the dynamics you accept, the conflicts you tolerate. At that point, being single has fulfilled its most important role: restoring emotional autonomy. The ability to stay not because it's convenient, but because it makes sense. The ability to leave without panic. The ability to be whole, even when you're with someone. Many people believe the ultimate goal is to be in a relationship, but the real goal is not needing one to feel complete. Paradoxically, those are the people who build the healthiest relationships, because they enter them out of desire, not necessity. Being single in this context isn't a pause in life. It's a recalibration phase, a time to adjust criteria, recognize old patterns, and redefine boundaries without external negotiation. A time to learn how to listen to small discomforts before they become big ones. That takes courage. It means facing silence, social comparison, and the feeling of being out of sync with expectations. It means holding unpopular choices, but it also offers something rare: internal freedom. Freedom to say no without guilt. Freedom to choose slowly. Freedom to stop confusing attention with connection. When that freedom is in place, future relationships stop carrying excess weight. They don't need to save, complete, or validate anyone. They just need to add. And that changes the quality of the bond entirely. That's why being single can be the best thing someone does. Not as a universal rule, but as a strategic decision at certain moments in life. A decision that protects the future instead of rushing it. In the end, it's not about being alone or being with someone. It's about where you're coming from when you enter a relationship. Entering out of fear creates fragile relationships. Entering out of clarity creates possible ones. And that difference changes everything. See you next time.